Just wanted to say thanks for joining us. My name's Kevin. I'm one of the event hosts here at Powell's Books. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. One of the many events we're looking forward to is Carrot Quinn in conversation with detransition baby author Tori Peters, and that's going to be about Quinn's new memoir, The Sunset Route. That is tomorrow night. And if you don't already do so, please follow us on social media. Tonight, we are so excited to welcome Omar El Akkad and Roy Scranton. Omar El Akkad is an author and journalist. He's reported from Afghanistan, Guantanamo Bay, and many other locations around the world. His writing has appeared in The Guardian, Le Monde, Guernica, GQ, and many other newspapers and magazines. His debut, American War, is an international bestseller and has been translated into 13 languages. It won the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association Award and the Oregon Book Award for Fiction, and also the Kobo Emerging Writer Prize, and it was nominated for more than 10 other awards. His new book, What Strange Paradise, is a beautifully written, unrelentingly dramatic, and profoundly moving novel that brings the global refugee crisis down to the level of a child's eyes. More bodies have washed up on the shores of a small island. Another overfilled, ill-equipped, dilapidated ship has sunk under the weight of its too many passengers. Syrians, Ethiopians, Egyptians, Lebanese, Palestinians, all of them desperate to escape untenable lives in their homelands. And only one has made the passage, 9-year-old Amir, a Syrian boy who has the good fortune to fall into the hands, not of the officials, but of Vänna, a teenage girl native to the island, who lives inside her own sense of homelessness in a place among people she has come to disdain. And though she and the boy are complete strangers, though they don't speak a common language, she determines to do whatever it takes to save him. In alternating chapters, we learn the story of the boy's life and how he came to be on the boat, and we follow the girl and boy as they make their way toward a vision of safety. Omar joins us tonight from right here in Portland, Oregon. Joining El Akkad in conversation this evening is Roy Scranton. Scranton is the author of several books. His latest are Total Mobilization, World War II and American Literature, and the novel I Heart Oklahoma. He teaches at the University of Notre Dame, where he is director of the Environmental Humanities Initiative, and he joins us tonight from Rockport, Maryland. This evening's event will also include an audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question, as well as if someone has typed a question that you would like to know the answer to, please upvote, give that question a thumbs up. And most importantly, please consider supporting Omar and Powell's by purchasing a copy of his new novel from us. A link to buy What Strange Paradise, along with a link to Roy's books, will be shared in the chat a couple of times this evening. Omar, Roy, it's so exciting to have you both with us tonight.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
It's a pleasure. Before we start, I just want to say thank you so much to Roy for doing this. For those of you who are not familiar with the way these things work ahead of time, ahead of publication, your publisher will ask you, who are the writers you admire, who are the writers you're friends with, who are the writers you can safely blackmail to convince them to do something like this. And Roy was at the top of my list, even though I have nothing to blackmail him with. He is an incredible, incredible writer. And for those of you not familiar with his work, if you've ever read anything of mine and thought, this isn't terrifying enough, I would like this in a flavor of nonfiction, please read his essays. He's one of the finest essayists in the country and a writer of incredible fiction in styles that nobody else is doing. And just an incredible thinker about literature in general. So thank you for doing this, Roy. I really appreciate it.
Well, that's very flattering, Omar and I.
I've been reading it. I was reading it off a script. You can't see it in the camera, but this is from your Wikipedia page.
I just want to say, not to turn it into too much of a ritual, but I mean, I'm so honored and excited to be here. I've admired your work for a long time, and it was really it's been a blast getting to know you over the years, and I'm sure a lot of the readers of American War are here tonight. That was a fantastic book, and this book goes in a different direction and does a different thing, but it's still recognizably in the Omar El Akkad world, and still and also has your your attention to detail and your craft and your magnificent storytelling. And it's just really, it's my pleasure and honor to be here. You don't even have to blackmail me. I would have done it for free. I'm doing it for free.
That's good. Yeah, I was going to say.
But thank you for all the nice things you said about my work. That's really touching. It means a lot to me because I think you're an incredible writer yourself. So that's great.
Please.
No, I think do you want to, were you going to, I don't.
Should we start with the reading, or should we start with something else? We're making this up on the spot as we go.
Yeah, I suspect a lot of these folks probably haven't read the book yet, because it just comes out. It's just come out, right? So maybe you should give them a taste of things, and then we can get into the discussion.
So yeah, thank you all for showing up to this. I appreciate it, and thank you so much to Powell's for arranging this. I owe a huge portion of my career to Powell's and their support over the years. They also did an incredible job of sort of ruining bookstore events for me during the American War tour, because the very first bookstore event I did was in Powell's on Burnside, the main branch. And I walk into the room and there's 60 people there, because that's what people show up to book events at Powell's. It's not because of me, but and I walk in and I think, oh, surely this is what it's like all of the time. This is going to be great. And 2 weeks later, I'm in Tampa doing an event in front of 2.5 people. 2 people showed up, and the third guy was there by accident, but was too embarrassed to get up and leave, because there's literally 3 people in the room. So I'm very, very grateful to Powell's for doing this. I wrote a book. It's called What Strange Paradise. It's my second novel, my second published novel, my 5th novel. There is a young woman who, unless somebody has the exact same name, is one of my closest friends, and she lives in Toronto, and she's on this call right now, who is my first reader on all my manuscripts, my friend Anna. And she's read the 3 unpublishable books, and she was the first reader on American War and What Strange Paradise. If you dislike any of those books, it's her fault. She gave me the first set of edits on it. What Strange Paradise is a repurposed fairy tale. It's the story of Peter Pan, repurposed as the story of a contemporary child refugee. You go into these things, or at least I go into these things generally, with a kind of very overarching mission statement. And the one I had for this one was this idea of taking a comforting fairy tale that Westerners have been telling their kids for the last 100 years and inverting it to tell a different kind of story, which thematically puts the book in the same space as American War, which was another kind of inversion, another kind of sort of using the geography of a place to tell a different kind of story. When we talk about Peter Pan, we generally talk about, Peter Pan syndrome and this idea of like the man who refuses to stop acting like a child. The origins of the fairy tale have much darker and sort of inverted roots. J.M. Barrie, the author, his brother died young. He died at 13 in a skating accident, I believe, and it sort of crushed the family. And those are the roots from which years later Peter Pan emerges as a character. It's much more about the child who never gets to become a man than the other way around. So the book opens with a child who's the sole survivor of a migrant shipwreck. It's a ship that had been going across the Mediterranean, headed for Europe. It capsized, and he's the sole survivor. He opens his eyes, he doesn't know where he is, and immediately sort of chased by officials in this sort of unnamed Western island. And from that point on, the book alternates, the chapters alternate between what happens once he gets on the island and how he got to be on the island, the story sort of leading up to that. It is in many ways a very different book than American War, but in my mind, it's thematically very similar. So what I'll do, if you'll indulge me, I'm just going to read sort of the first couple of pages. I will not take up too much of your time doing this, but this is from the very beginning of the book. The child lies on the shore. All around him, the beach is littered with the wreckage of the boat and the wreckage of its passengers. Shards of decking, knapsacks cleaved and gutted, bodies frozen in unnatural contortion. Dispossessed of nightfall's temporary burial, the dead ferment indecency. There's too much of spring in the day, too much light. Face down with his arms outstretched, the child appears from a distance as though playing at flight. And so too in the bodies that surround him, though distended with seawater and hardening, there flicker the remnants of some silent levitation, a severance from the laws of being. The sea is tranquil now, the storm has passed. The island, despite the debris, is calm. A pair of plump, orange-necked birds, stragglers from a northbound flock, take rest on the lamppost from which hangs one end of a police cordon. In the breaks between the wailing of the sirens and the murmur of the onlookers, they can be heard singing. The species is not unique to the island, nor the island to the species, but the birds, when they stop here, change the pitch of their songs. The call is an octave higher, a sharp throat-scraping thing. In time, a crowd gathers near the site of the shipwreck, tourists and locals alike. People watch. The eldest of them, an arthritic fisherman driven in recent years by plummeting cherubfish stocks to kitchen work at a nearby resort, says that it's never been like this before on the island. Other locals nod, because even though the history of this place is that of violent endings, of galleys flipped over the axis of their oars, and fishing skiffs tangled in their own netting, and once during the war, an empty Higgins lander sheared to ribbons by shrapnel, the old man is still in his own way right. These are foreign dead. No one can remember exactly when they first started washing up along the eastern coast, but in the last year it has happened with such frequency that many of the nations on whose tourists the island's economy depends have issued travel advisories. The hotels and resorts in turn have offered discounts. Between them, the Coast Guard and the morgue keep a partial count of the dead, and as of this morning, it stands at 1,026, but this number is as much an abstraction as the dead themselves are to the people who live here, to whom all the shipwrecks of the previous year are a single shipwreck, all the bodies a single body. 3 officers from the municipal police force pull a long strip of caution tape along the breadth of the walkway that leads from the road to the beach. Another 3 wrestle with large sheets of blue boat cover canvas, trying to build a curtain between the dead and their audience. In this way, the destruction takes on an air of queer unreality, a stage play bled of movement, a fairy tale upturned. The officers, all of them young and impatient, manage to tether the fabric to a couple of lampposts, from which the orange-necked birds whistle and flee. But even stretched to near tearing, the canvas does little to hide the dead from view. Some of the onlookers shuffle awkwardly to the far end of the parking lot, where there's still an acute line of sight between the draping and 4 television news trucks. Others climb on top of parked cars and sweep their cameras across the width of the beach, some with their backs to the carnage, their own faces occupying the center of the recording. The dead become the property of the living. Oriented as they are, many of the shipwrecked bodies appear as though to have been spat up landward by the sea, or of their own volition to have walked out from its depths and then collapsed a few feet later. Except the child. Relative to the others, he is inverted, his head closest to the lapping waves, his feet nestled into the warmer, lighter sand that remains dry even at highest tide. He is small, but somewhere along the length of his body marks the sea's furthest reach. A wave brushes gently against the child's hair. He opens his eyes. Thank you so much for your patience with that, everyone. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. That's tremendous. And it, it's lovely to hear you read those first opening pages. And so, yeah, and as you read, I notice some of these little details that sort of foreshadow things that come later and strike some of your thematic concerns. A fairy tale upturned, right? We were just talking about the Peter Pan, and also the way that Amir is inverted relative to the other passengers on the boat. Like even just that visual cue seems quite striking. So I want to start with just a sort of clearly this is a very powerful sort of even spectacular kind of and poetic opening, and I would love to hear you talk about some of where the book came from for you. You were talking about the J.M. Barrie and the Peter Pan, which is important, and I want to ask more about later. But I also, it seems like in some way, that iconic photo of Alan Kurdi, right, who the 3-year-old boy, 3-year-old Syrian refugee whose body washed up on the beach in Turkey after the raft he was on capsized. His parents were trying to get him to Canada by way of a Greek island, and that image, was so important in 2015 for discussions of the refugee crisis and for elections in Canada, and remains a kind of iconic image. And so Amir also, right, washes up on the beach, and you've sort of taken, it's not the same image, but you've brought this to life in this other context, and I would just love to hear you talk about your thoughts on that image and the role it played, and whether it had anything to do with the genesis of this book, and sort of how this book did emerge for you, and how, I guess, sort of that, and then also if you want to say more about the sort of the Peter Pan aspect of it, or we can talk more about that later. But that'll be first.
It's I think this as well as I do, right? Like after you create the book, you have the privilege of sort of inventing a clean Genesis story of
right.
This happened, and then I wrote the book.
Yeah.
And I have one for American War, and to be honest, I have one for this one. There's two moments that stick out in my head, which is there are moments that never inspire. You don't get the opening sentence as a result, but you get the sort of road that you're then going to walk down to maybe one day get to the work at the end of it. And the first one was I was still working full time as a journalist at the time. It was, I think, 2012, and I was back in Egypt. It was during one of those instances when Israel was bombing the hell out of Gaza, and my paper sent me to Egypt with the idea that I would cross through the border and get into Gaza. And the day I landed was the day of the ceasefire. So I ended up covering instead the protests that happened a few days later against Morsi, which started the sort of the military coup that followed. But
yeah.
Anyway, I come from Egypt. I was born there. My whole extended family is from there. And I was driving around town one night with an old high school buddy, and he was complaining about the rent, which is the most universal complaint there is, right? The rent's too high. And at one point I asked him, well, what's the average rent in your apartment building? And he said, well, do you mean the locals' price or do you mean the Syrians' price? I said, well, what the hell's the Syrians' price? And he said, well, we've been having a lot of refugees come down here fleeing, and they don't have very much leverage. So they get charged 3 times the price. What are they going to do about it? Go somewhere else?
Wow.
And it quickly became apparent that this happened not just in rents, but like you go down to get some vegetables from the street side stall, and it would be the same case. And I was thinking about this in the context of all of the Arab leaders that I've been hearing for years and decades talk about our Syrian brothers and sisters, our Palestinian brothers and sisters. We all stand hand in hand. It was all bullshit. It was, when it came down to it, there was a population that could be exploited, and it was going to be exploited. And so that got me thinking about some of the things that ended up sort of shaping the book. The other instance was a while later, I was reading a story of a migrant ship that had capsized, that had gone under in the Mediterranean, and the details were about as horrific as you would expect.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I remember about this is that this particular story inspired this incredible outrage for about 24 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And then within 24 hours, everybody had moved on.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you talk about this idea of the iconic image.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what scares me about the kind of moral framework that we've developed. It's not enough for it to be an iconic image. And when I was writing this book, there was iconic image after iconic image.
Right.
You know, towards the end of the writing and editing process, there was the iconic image of a man and his daughter trying to get to the US through the southern border, and they'd been swimming and they drowned.
Right.
And it was this image, and it was crushing, and it caused so much outrage for 24 hours. And then everybody moved on. And I think more than almost anything else, what drove me to write this particular book is this idea of trying to write against the privilege of instantaneous forgetting.
Mm-hmm.
To try and dwell, even if on a fictional story, even if on a fable, a fairy tale,
Mm-hmm.
to not look away, or to pretend that looking away has consequences. Those were the things that were going on in my head. And I know it's all abstractions and may not relate to the material in the book in any kind of concrete way, but that's sort of what I was thinking about.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I've, thought about this a lot with, images from war zones, or, from outside of war zones, like you're talking about. And, in some ways, how it seemed that, and even also with climate change, we're inundated with images, right? There, we, like you were saying, like iconic image after iconic image, which raises an interesting question about the relationship between image and narrative, and how we sit with that. And I hear, I hear you saying that the part of the impetus for this book was to resist that the churn, the meme churn, right? And the media churn, to try to linger here in this moment, in this life. And that seems to, and it distends both backward and forward into time, right? That's sort of in the temporal structure of the book. Which brings up, I guess, I'm going to go right to, the tricky question here, about this. You sort of touched on it with the Peter Pan inside of the inspiration, and the sort of, inverted fairy tale. But there's and you have a J.M. Barrie Peter Pan epigraph at the beginning of the book, which is lovely. I taught you to fight and to fly. What more could there be? But then you have another epigraph at the beginning of the book too, which is from Ambrose Bierce's short story, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. And that reads, it did not appear to be the duty of these two men to know what was occurring at the center of the bridge. They merely blockaded the two ends of the foot planking that traversed it. And that's a really interesting epigraph for how it gestures toward the role that the soldiers play in relation to, one of the main strands in the book, right? So it's probably worth telling, gesturing for your readers to, there's the before strand, you've mentioned the alternating chapters, the before strand, right? Which takes us from basically from Homs to Alexandria in Egypt, to this boat in the Mediterranean, and then the moment where that boat capsizes, and that's sort of Amir's backstory. And then there's the after chapters, which as has been mentioned, right? Take us from when Amir wakes on the beach and is and runs off, and then is sort of taken in by this young girl, Vänna Hermes, um, which we can talk more about. And then she sort of takes care of him and hides him from the military, these like 4 soldiers and a colonel who are responsible for rounding up all the refugees that wind up on this island. And then that strand becomes this kind of, you know, it's like this negative, right? Like the boat story is like, it is an adventure story, but it's a very realistic, miserable, horrible adventure story. And then there's the adventure story with Vänna and Amir, which is, it's more lighthearted. It still feels very tense, but it's this other kind of adventure story on the island. And so it's worth getting that set out. And the soldiers are sort of, you know, in ambivalent relationship to their job of hunting down refugees. And we can talk more about Colonel Kethros, is that right? Yeah, Kethros. But this Ambrose Bierce thing, right? I want to, the story that your epigraph is from is famous. It's a famous Civil War, the most famous probably American Civil War short story. And its entire conceit is that it's about a guy who's a plantation owner who's being hung from a bridge by Union soldiers. And then the rope snaps and he escapes, and he runs home through the woods. But then right when he gets home, he feels this sudden shock and there's a bright flash. And then we realize, you know, the POV shifts and we realize that all that part of the story happened when he was in his last moment, right? As he dropped and he died. And so then similarly, What Strange Paradise seems to end, and spoiler alert, so folks, if you don't want to hear that, you know, mute me for a second, with Vänna and Amir escaping on a boat to the mainland. But then there's another chapter, right, titled Now, where it seems like it takes us back to the very beginning, and something else has happened. So I just want to, I don't know, there's so much to talk about here. And I want to ask you, like, sort of, what is an incident or an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge? Like, what work is that doing for you in the book? And like, what's, and what brings you to that narrative structure, and how's that, you know, how's that happening for you here?
I'm gonna say it's so simultaneously gratifying and terrifying to talk to a literature professor about your work. I'm going to do a couple of insufferable things here. The first is, I'm going to say I spent a lot of time on the epigraphs, getting the epigraphs right, which is such an insufferable writer thing to say. I spent a lot of time finding the 2 right quotes that would, but it is the case that if you're, you know, if you're familiar with Peter Pan, if you're familiar with An Occurrence at Owl Creek, this is a very different book. The book reads very differently depending on how familiar you are with the source material. And one of the really fascinating things so early on, when I got to about draft 3 or 4, I don't quite remember. After my friend Anna had read it, I decided to show it to a couple of people, and 4 people read it. My agent's friend, who she gave to for a second opinion, and 2 of my other friends. And all 4 of them came back with 4 entirely different interpretations of what the hell had happened in this book.
Wonderful.
Which I was not prepared for at all, because in my mind, I had a rehash of what had happened with American War, where I thought the kind of book I was trying to write would be very evident to everybody who read it. And all of a sudden I start to get readings of the book that have nothing to do with what I thought the book was about. And it was strange to have it happen for something like this, which is a much shorter, much quieter kind of book. A lot of the things that live in What Strange Paradise kind of live beneath the surface, not because I'm some kind of misunderstood genius, but that's just the structure of the book. This even happened with some of the blurbs for What Strange Paradise, where I'm reading the blurb and I'm thinking, I'm so grateful for this. Thank you for your interpretation of the book is so different from mine. Like it's a weird place to be, and in the end, it's also very gratifying, because again, like Cindy's saying in the chat, the book becomes different things to different people, and in the end, you're creating this thing that's going to outlive you, that's going to be sitting on a library shelf somewhere collecting dust long after you're dead. And it's nice to know that it lives all these different lives. The second insufferable thing I'm going to do is name drop, because I've been stuck in the house for 18 months. And I need to let everybody know that I was recently talking to somebody famous. So I was on a Zoom call with Margaret Atwood, who by some miracle had been, we have the same publisher in Canada, and I assume that's how she got a hold of my book, took the time to read it, and had honed in on that occurrence at Owl Creek thing, and very quickly and far more eloquently than I ever could, sort of explained my book to me in passing, just so like just freehand, was like, this is what you meant. I was like, yeah, that's what I meant. And then she said, don't think that slipped by me. No, it didn't slip. It slipped past like my editors. It's that, so you and Margaret Atwood are the only people to hone in on that. I tried to write a book that took place at the collision of two fantasies. This fantasy that's very prevalent in the part of the world where I grew up, which is that the West is a cure for all ills. And if I can just get there, everything will sort itself out. And then the fantasy headed in the other direction, that all these people coming to our shores are barbarians at the gate, and we need to keep them out at all costs. And if that means burning the whole place to the ground just so they don't get it, so be it. And so that has a lot to do with the particular sentence that I chose from that short story. This idea of reality, the reality of these human beings floating somewhere in the middle between these two fantasies that are completely unconcerned with reality. It doesn't matter in the slightest what reality actually is. And so that was my thinking around it when I was constructing the story. And of course, structurally, if you're familiar with those two pieces of work, you know how the book is gonna play out in a certain way. Yeah. But you sort of live with this weird tightrope, right? Where it's a land of dreams as well as nightmares. Exactly. It's you're walking this tightrope with what you're trying to bury underneath the text. Mm-hmm. And if it's hidden too deep, it's as though it never existed.
Right.
And as soon as it pokes out of the surface, then it's too obvious, and it's sort of like, I don't want to join any club that would have me as a member. If I can make out the reference. Like, I'm sure at one point you rolled your eyes at Vänna's last name and the sort of like, the way that sort of structurally, but again, you're a literature professor. So, but I don't know. It's a lot of the book was sort of trying to balance those two things, trying to balance the ways that structurally I wanted to make the book. I wanted the book to reference, and finding a way to have it be buried and not buried at the same time. I don't know if I succeeded in any of this, but that was sort of what I was thinking about.
Yeah, no, I think you succeeded marvelously. Because it's precisely that kind of work that can sustain multiple interpretations, and that in its very structure sort of sustains multiple realities, right, at the same time. And that's interesting what you say about the multiple fantasies, and that seems key. That seems like to be a key, theme through the work is the different fantasies that that the refugees on the boat are bringing, and the what relation to fantasy, Amir's time on the island, what relation Amir's time on the island bears to fantasy and reality. And there's also, this collision of different fantasies is also a collision of those fantasies with the realities, right? That lie behind them in their complexity. And that's another thing I wanted to ask about is, I guess, some of the research you've done for this, and how that relates to the research you did for American War, and how those come out of your journalism background. And I also, one of the things I appreciated, and I'll ask more about Kethro specifically, but one of the things I appreciated very much in this book and in American War is how textured the supporting cast is it are, and how the not only are the refugees not a mass just of undifferentiated refugees, like they're all people who, there's the Eritrean mathematician, and there's the the guy who's studying English, and they're very distinct people with their own stories, who aren't coming onto stage to sing their song. They're just living in their reality, in a very in their complex ways, and trying to manage their own their own struggles, as they intersect with your with your main character. But then even people like Vänna's parents, for instance, it seemed to be this Swedish couple who've started tried to start a guest house on a Greek island, and just the the texture of the characters that you bring to life. It feels like these are people, these are people you talked to, you interviewed, and so I just would invite you to, can you talk some about the sort of the research and the backstories, and the sort of the people that are for you. The fiction is always a transmutation, of course, and masks and magic and illusions, but it's also there's a aliquid salus, right? There's something assault, there's reality in there. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, it's I think the ways in which it resembles American War, on the sort of research plotting side, is that it's a smorgasbord of experiences, personal experiences, journalistic experiences, and then research, the way you do research. You pick up a bunch of books and you read them. There were elements of the things that happened in Alexandria that were things I saw, growing up there, and then visiting again back when we lived in the Middle East, and we go back to Egypt every year, and then the ways in which I'd seen the country change over the years, going back. Some of these folks on the boat, I mean, I'm not one of these people who steals human beings from the entire character, but and puts it in the book, sort of thing. I don't generally tend to write based on people I know. I knew someone like Walid bin Walid. There's a guy on the boat named Walid bin Walid, and he is a coward, and he is a very dignified coward. He's very much sort of concerned with his own safety at the cost of anybody or anything else, including his own dignity if he has to, but he would never admit it. I knew that guy. Like I know what that's like. One of the strange things about constructing that particular part of the book is that the dialogue is taking place in my head in Arabic, almost exclusively. There's certain parts where the characters are clearly speaking English, but the rest of it, for the most part, when they're talking to each other, it's happening in Arabic in my head, and then I'm translating it onto the page. And I had to make a decision, for example, about whether I wanted to switch out of that mode so as to get rid of some of the clunkiness of the dialogue, or to stick with it. And I decided to stick with it. There's a very real cost to that in the text, because that's how it was sort of playing out in my head. The research I started, as you would expect, reading everything I could about that journey, and the sort of minor details of using party balloons as waterproof containers. It's the cheapest kind of waterproof container that you can put squeeze your cell phone in there, or your keys, or whatever it is you're taking with you. The idea that some of these smugglers will sell life vests that are they're not just shot, they're the opposite of life vests. They're filled with foam. You're going to sink. They're going to take in water, and you're going to sink if you are wearing these things. all of these details of which there is no shortage. We know these things, we just choose to ignore them. But the book that influenced me the most writing this novel is a book called The Wandering Jews, which is about 100 years old. And it's a nonfiction account of Jews in Eastern Europe who are fleeing horrific persecution and trying to get to the west of the continent, and the entirely different kind and yet somehow similar kind of persecution they faced once they got there.
Right.
And so many of the details felt like they were pulled out yesterday. And those echoes, the idea of how little has changed in terms of that asymmetry and that stripping away of agency, heavily influenced the book, at least on a thematic level as well. So it was a strange sort of combination of all of these things: personal experiences, journalistic experiences, and then the research that goes into, I think, any book that deals with a topic like this.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. So I want to make sure to open things up. I know there's people out there who probably have questions as well, who may have read the book or maybe not. Maybe they want to ask you questions about American War, but it'd be great to focus on this book. But so I want to open it up. If you have questions, I guess we put it in the chat, right? And then I can moderate those and bring them out. I'll read them aloud for Omar in the Q&A. Sorry, not the chat. Yeah, there's a Q&A that's, I don't know. There it is. Aha. Okay. Here's some. I just found that on my screen. Sorry. So yeah, I'll just start with these then. The first, it looks like the first question is from Martina Gali, and she asks, what I'll do is I'll just throw these 3 questions at you, and then if more come in, we can go from there. All right. So the first is from Martina Gali. Where did the character of Amir come from? The second from Sarah Reif. You've been a journalist and a novelist. How do these types of writing differ for you? Or maybe they're the same in surprising ways. And if it's not too nebulous, how do you see these mediums' roles in storytelling and conveying truth or impacting hearts and minds? It's a big question I wanted to get to myself. And then from Anonymous, were there any epigraphs that almost made the cut?
That's such a good question. All right, let's start at the beginning. So thank you for that, everybody, and please feel free to ask me anything at all about either book. I have absolutely no problem playing Freebird. If you've just read American War and that's what you want to ask me about, that is absolutely no problem. So the character of Amir, there are these things that are the real sort of starting points of the writing of the book in terms of something you see. With American War, it was just an image of a girl sitting on her front porch pouring honey into the knots of the wood. I can't tell you why that image popped into my head. It just did. And that for me marks the moment where I started crafting the story. I think of these things very sort of visually, and I have to be in the place, and that brought that to me. In the case of this book, for no discernible reason, I had an image of a child walking out of a forest, and at the edge of the forest, locking eyes with it was a little boy and the girl at the other end of the road, and they make contact, they make eye contact, and I don't know why any of this happened. It's just this image that struck me as being particularly hard to get out of my head. So that's the first time that I see Amir. As a character, he is the character of Peter Pan, which I was reading a biography of J.M. Barrie, who had, at one point, he was the most famous playwright in the world. He was a huge celebrity and he had all of the success. He also had a very sort of dark life. He had very little sort of family of his own as a grown man, and started to depend very heavily on this couple that he knew and their, I believe, 5 boys. And Peter Pan is a composite of those children. their personalities and who they were. And then at least one of them died in the war, and another one died young. And the one who was the main influence grew up to become, I believe, an independent book publisher, but could never escape the celebrity of being Peter Pan, and ended up taking his own life. It's incredibly dark underpinning. And so Amir, for me, is a character who is, I mean, he's a young child, and he's not, he like all children, he has very little overarching agency over what's happening around him. And in the context of what's happening in the book, he, you know, I think I'm drawn to childhood because I talk about this idea that I think childhood is a time of our only honest interaction with the world before we're sort of compelled into being the adults we need to be to get through the day. And so I think he's the prism through which that world is shown. But primarily, he is someone who is, I think, a fundamentally good person who has zero agency over his life and is trying to navigate the fantasy of other people's privilege, people deciding what should happen to him. And some of those people are good and some of them are evil, but all of them have the privilege of deciding on his behalf. And he's trying to contend with that world. In terms of journalism versus fiction and sort of how that works for me, I think they're antagonistic muscles. I think, you know, when I overwork one of them and not the other, I'm liable to get injured, much like this metaphor is getting injured now. That did not work at all. But I mean, you go into journalism for you need to have answers to make it work. Who, what, where, when, how. If you don't have those, you don't have really a work of journalism. The problem with that, at least from my experience, and it may well be the case that I was just not a very good journalist, but you collect these residual experiences, the residual sort of emotional baggage of having witnessed these things. And on top of that, knowing that you had the privilege of witnessing these things, because you're often covering horrible things, but you know in the end that you're a tourist. You know in the end that you can leave. And so you collect this stuff, and that comes in the form of questions. I don't have answers to any of this stuff. I can't say, and the way I dealt with this was, you know, insert prescriptive thing here. So fiction for me is where the questions go. I don't think if I'm fortunate enough to continue having a career, I don't think I'm ever going to write a book that contains its own answers. It's not what I do. I try to go in the opposite direction. So they work together, these muscles. They for me anyway, they translate into an ability to not just let these experiences and the emotional toll kind of build up and build up and build up until it crushes you, because you've only been working one side of that. So that's generally sort of how I think about it. There were epigraphs that did not make the cut. I tried a bunch. I tried originally, actually, the title of the book, What Strange Paradise, comes from a poem, a lesser known poem, which I think I'm now in the process, not by virtue of quality, but just by virtue of quantity. I'm now in the process of crushing the Google search results for. If you search for that line, What Strange Paradise, it used to be that you got the line from the poem, and now increasingly it's just, angry reviews of my book. But it's a line from a poem by Emma Lazarus. Emma Lazarus is the poet who's most famous for The New Colossus, which is the poem that's etched into the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, poor, your huddled masses. And she was deeply, deeply concerned with the plight of Jewish refugees. And she has this one incredible poem. The poem from which What Strange Paradise comes is actually not one of my favorite poems by Emma Lazarus. It's I think of it as entirely too melodramatic. She's written some incredible stuff. She wrote a poem about two Jewish refugees who escape Europe and eventually find themselves in very rural Texas. And it's this poem about these two people sitting around saying, "Whew, we're safe, thank God." what the hell is this place? They have no frame of reference, no capacity. Like, everything feels fundamentally alien. So the line comes from one of her poems, and originally I had used a number of different epigraphs from Emma Lazarus' poems, because I think the work she was doing really resonated with me, of trying to explain not only, hey, there are poor refugees out there and you should feel sorry for them, but also that there is this constellation of emotions that you feel when you're in this position, including the idea of, hey, we're safe now, what? That's to me a much more nuanced thing to explore. So originally there were a number of lines from her poetry that were in the epigraphs, but once I settled on the two that are in there, it might be the only part of the novel that I'm actually certain about. I'm pretty confident that that's how that page needed to be. Everything else in the book, deep uncertainty, but yeah.
That's great. So a couple other questions have come in. Anne Gibbon asks, why a boy and not a girl for the main character? What informed that choice? And then Martina Gali asks another question, and referring back to American War, and she's wondering, how far do you think Surratt's ending is paradoxical for female agency? So I guess they're both sort of gender related questions.
Thank you for that. So I should say that in my mind, and maybe folks who read the new novel will disagree, but in my mind, Amir is not the central character in the novel. I have my Peter Pan and I have my Wendy, and Amir and Vänna, and the relationship, the asymmetry of that relationship, to me is the central core of the novel. I come back to this a lot because my first novel centered a female character, and obviously that is outside my experience. It happens to be that the sort of most profound experiences I've had in my life that have shaped me have come from the women in my life. In my family, my closest friends, and so on and so forth. And that translates into where I go when I write. But the sort of the origin of Amir as a Peter Pan character, and all of the work that his last name is Utu being the Mesopotamian god who in physical form is closest to Pan, and all of this stuff that you sort of put into the novel, expecting none of it to ever see the light of day. But the novel had a pre-existing structure from which I could steal or not steal as I saw fit, and that was the structure of Peter Pan. So originally in the first draft, I even had as many chapters. I copied the 17 chapters of that sort of thing, and that quickly turned completely, like it didn't work structurally. You could tell that it was very, very contrived. So when you have that kind of container, you work within it. But one of the ways it differs from American War is the American War for me is Surratt's story, first and foremost. Whereas What Strange Paradise is the story of a relationship. In fact, in that book, the character who to me is most compelling is the villain. This is guy Colonel Kethros, who might be the only honest character in the book. He's the only one who isn't lying to himself. He's not lying to himself about his xenophobia, his racism, his worldview entirely. Whereas all the good characters are constantly having to lie to themselves to get through the day. So that I think is a difference between those two books. With respect to the ending of American War, I've had so much trouble over the years with. I write books that are easy to hate, and easy to hate for valid reasons, and I find this out mostly when I go to book clubs. Book clubs are very, very passionate about this sort of thing, and the ending is brought up all of the time. It pisses a lot of people off how that novel ended, which is difficult for me because when I went into writing American War, the only things I knew were how it would start and how it would end. I ended up rewriting the prologue 12 times and the epilogue, God knows how many times, but I knew thematically what would happen. And I couldn't change that. Those were the only two load-bearing beams holding up an otherwise very amorphous book. So I don't know how paradoxical an ending it is. I do know that the entire construction of the lead up to the ending, if you draw a line from the beginning of this book to the end, relates to Surratt's ever shrinking circle of trust. When we first meet her, her circle of trust encompasses the entirety of the world. She believes everything everyone tells her. And the more damage she's subjected to is that circle, the more that circle closes. Then it encompasses just her family and then just certain members of her family. And towards the end, it's just her sense of revenge. And so I don't know how paradoxical the ending is, but to me, it seems like the conclusion of that circle closing into nothing, closing into a kind of nihilism. That's sort of how I think about that.
Yeah. I mean, in my reading as well, I mean, Amir is the, sort of the structural linchpin that, in some sense, that holds the book together. But it seems like, in terms of character, Vänna is hugely important, and as you pointed out, Kethros as well, and as the villain, and also as, or at least, he says late in the book, I'm the only one who believes in you. Like, I'm the only one who believes that you're real, which I thought was it's a very powerful moment in the book. I wanted to, there's another question up. So I would love to, and then we're also nearing the end of time. So this, not the end of all time, but the end of our time.
We don't know for sure.
We don't know for sure. So I would love to talk more with you about this. I'll have to watch other people talk with you about this book and read your interviews. It's just, I want to plug it for a moment and tell everyone here to buy this immediately from Powell's. It's a fantastic book, and it bears rereading and thinking about, and it's moving and beautiful and complex, and it's also, it has this sort of Peter Pan adventure sense to it. It's I guess what I'm saying is that, in some sense, it's a page turner, right? So it goes down smooth, even though the subject material, the subject matter is, human tragedy in our time. There's a question. Maybe this is the last question. But I'm going to try to squeeze in. So the question is, American War is a vivid view of a split in the US. Did January 6th validate that view, shock you into a new, more frightening one, or lead you to shrug your shoulders and say, yes, I've seen this before? And I don't want to editorialize on this question. I think it's, interesting, but I want to sort of frame that question more in the broader sense of bringing in one aspect of a previous question and sort of ask, how do you see the role of literature today in relation to, the tumult of reality? There's some dismissive things characters say about book readers in What Strange Paradise. But there's also, I'm not looking for, a ribbon, but I would be interested to hear you say, because you've done journalism, which does one thing, putting words into the world, into people's minds, but you do this other thing where you accentuate the questions that you leave people with. And I'm wondering if you can talk about the role you see that literature playing in that respect.
Sure. So January 6th happens to be my birthday. So that was a very strange day. You know, wake up
Wow.
and the kids give you a little birthday card, and then in the background in the TV, you have to change away from CNN because the imagery is not something that you want a 4-year-old to be seeing. It was a strange day for everybody. American War was my attempt to superimpose the story of a people who have very little voice in the world onto the geography, the political, emotional, societal geography of the most powerful place on earth. And what has happened is that the power of that place has overpowered what I was trying to do. And this has become a distinctly American book. And so, you know, you get these posts on Twitter where people are like, oh my God, it was prophetic. And it was like, no, you throw 350 pages worth of darts at the wall, you're going to hit the occasional bullseye. It's not, you know, it wasn't my attempt to try and predict any of this. I think I think the purpose of storytelling and literature in general is to momentarily relieve us of this crushing misconception that life makes sense. You walk into one of these books and you walk into a brief respite of irrationality. So much of what we do to ourselves and do to each other is irrational. Love is irrational. Hatred is irrational. Almost anything to do with memory is in some way irrational. And so one of the things that has happened over the years is that I've increasingly rid myself of the responsibility of setting a goal for what the book should do. I beyond the idea of grabbing somebody and saying, hey, for a brief moment, look through this different pair of eyes. I don't think there's an obligation to, certainly to try and contend with whatever the hell it is that's happening to America right now. This kind of derangement that maybe was there all along, but feels so much more conspicuous now in terms of what people think they can get away with. And how much comfort you can find and how much support you can find believing things that not that long ago would have had you sort of excommunicated to a certain very edge of the spectrum. And now there's an entire party that will happily cater not just at the fringes, but at the middle to what you believe. Whatever my work does in relation to that is endlessly fascinating to me, but I feel no obligation to set a goalpost. That's not my job.
I love the way you put it, though, of storytelling in fiction or literary works like this, offering a respite. And maybe I'm misinterpreting, offering a respite from the irrationality of the world in a kind of suspended, like you don't have to try to make it make sense anymore, right? The respite isn't necessarily from the irrationality, it's from the attempt to make it rational, right? So it's like it's the gift of inhabiting the question. It's the gift of inhabiting multiple interpretations. It's the gift of inhabiting multiple viewpoints on the same event, multiple realities, even multiple fantasies and realities living in the same moment, right? Which is the world we live in. But the gift that fiction gives us, right, is the opportunity to not try to reduce that, to not feel obliged to simplify in order to, do the kind of, processing we need to do to get through the day, or, get along with the people we live with, or, not go insane from too much information. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's beautiful. And I think you've completely succeeded with What Strange Paradise in doing just that. It's a phenomenal piece of work, and I'm really, it's been a absolute pleasure to talk with you about this book tonight. And so thank you so much. Thanks for allowing me to be a part of this and to pepper you with my meandering nerdy questions, my book nerd questions. And it's been a total privilege. So
thank you so much. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
And thanks to both of you. Thanks a lot, Roy, for being part of this event. This is one of Roy's books. It's a pretty timely book, actually, War and Climate Change. And this is Omar's new book. You can see the sticker autographed. He signed a bunch of books for us. So when you order it online, you'll get an autographed copy of that book. I'm going to put the link for the book in the chat. There it is right there. Click on that and order that book. And also our YouTube channel. Check out our YouTube channel. You can see all of our past events. This event will probably be going up tomorrow on the YouTube channel. And here's the link for that. And yeah, so your event will probably be going up there tomorrow afternoon. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming out. Thanks, Omar. Thanks, Roy. It was a great conversation. And everyone have a good night.
Thank you so much.